Good afternoon, everybody. Thanks for coming. Um, our moderator is running a little late, and before she gets here, I'm going to read a couple of passages from the book. Um, Quite difficult to choose passages. The book is about many, many things. Obviously, it's about politics. It's partly about the glamour of these two people and what they looked like and what they wore and their private lives. But I think at bottom, it's about their suffering. And that's what I'm going to concentrate on in these readings. So the first passage is in Robben Island, and it's 1967. It is the 6th year of Nelson Mandela's incarceration. In September 1967, during his 4th year on Robben Island, Nelson's mother came to see him. They had laid eyes on each other last just once since the end of the Rivonia trial in June 1964. When time came for them to say goodbye, the warders watching on beheld a wrenching scene. Nelson offered his mother his cheek, pressing it against the glass barrier between them, his eyes shut tight. And Nosekeni, as one warder remembered it, put her old bony hand out and stroked her son's face through the glass. On the path back to the visitors' block, to the prison, Nelson's emotions were laid bare in his gait. It was the first time I'd seen this tall, proud man bowed, the warder who accompanied him wrote. Nelson remembered his thoughts in this moment vividly. I was able to look at her as she walked away towards the boats that would take her to the mainland, he told a correspondent. Somehow the idea crossed my mind that I would never lay eyes on her again. A year later, Nosekeni was dead. It was afternoon when Nelson was informed, Mac Maharaj remembered. When someone is called to the office, he comes back with news. But Nelson walks straight to his cell without saying a word. Walter follows him, sits with him, comes out after a long time, says, "Chaps, this is what's happened. Don't crowd him. Go to him one by one, but give him space." We take turns to go to see him. He acknowledges our condolences. We leave. The next morning, Nelson comes out fighting. He wants to see the commanding officer. He wants to go to the funeral. Now he is talking to us, but he has built a screen. We can't get behind it, and that's it. No more mention of his mother. The letters he wrote at this time were in fact a wash with his mother, and he told his correspondents that with the news of her death he lost his footing, at least for some time. For a few days I spent moments in my cell which I never want to remember, he told one correspondent. While losing his mother at any time would have been hard, behind bars this news can be a shattering disaster. And in his case, he continues, it very nearly was. One gets the sense that he looked down an abyss when Nosekeni died, that it took some wherewithal to steady himself and find safe ground. How complex his mourning for his mother must have been, and how tinged with regret. I'd hoped to be able to look after her in her last days on earth, and to bury her when she died, he wrote to his oldest daughter. Wrapped in his filial grief, it seems, was his mourning of the place from which he was severed, and in which he was profoundly and fundamentally a black man and an African. There's something else that happened to Nelson Mandela in prison, which is also about suffering, but it's about something that happens to long-term prisoners. When you're in prison, you think of the people on the outside all the time, but you lose touch with simple things about them, like they're growing old, like the arc of time of who the person you love is becoming, who you're becoming. And in this next passage, I guess quite a disturbing passage, it takes place in 1979, and his daughter Zinzi, who is 18 years old, comes to see him, and he mistakes her for his 42-year-old wife, and this is what happens next. Sometimes I feel like one who is on the sidelines, who has missed life itself, Nelson wrote to Winnie in January 1979. Touching your hand or hugging you as you moved up and down the house, enjoying your delicious dishes, the unforgettable hours in the bedroom, make life taste like honey. As so often in his letters, he suddenly turned to an uncomfortable subject. On the 2nd of December, Zinzi hinted that she and you planned to be here on her birthday. I looked forward to that day, as I would be seeing both of you together for the first time. But on the morning of the day, I prayed that you might not come. Unconsciously, during the previous day and night, I worked a little harder than I realized. I thought the eyes might betray me again, much to your concern, as when visited me on the 21st of October. I was therefore much relieved when you didn't turn up. He writes obscurely, in parts to shelter from prying eyes, and perhaps too because he's embarrassed. Subsequent gossip among prison warders who witnessed the incident makes its nature clearer. The previous October, Zinzi had come to see him, and he had mistaken her for his wife. Zinzi, one assumes, reported what had happened to her mother. Winnie's reaction, probably in a letter, is inaccessible, but it must have been severe, for Nelson now woke to discover that he was dreading seeing her. One wonders whether it was a moment of revelation for Winnie. She had long remembered that Nelson's view of her was frozen in time. I often wonder, she'd written back in 1970, if your memory of me isn't of a trembling little girl standing next to you in a shabby little back-felt church. Every subsequent letter he wrote to her must have deepened her unease. Here was a man replaying, over and over, a romance from 1958. Those encounters on Robben Island, he on one side of the glass, she on the other. She must have known that they carried into that room increasingly discrepant views of each other, of their marriage, of whatever future they might have together. She had not actually seen him, she wrote, in the early 1980s, since before he went to jail. The lighting in the visiting room on Robben Island was very bad, and the glass partitions so thick, I could never see a clear picture of him, just a silhouette, really. Did she wonder how on earth they would make a marriage, were he to be freed? It was probably unfathomable, a question to be put off. I have one more while we wait. After that, I'll have to make something up. um, the next selection, this takes place in the late 1970s. Winnie Mandela was banished to Brandfort, a small village in the middle of the Free State, in 1977. And something you would get from this book is that she's a person who, more than most people, finds it very difficult to be alone. Solitude is not a friend to her. And that first year in Brandfort is a living hell for her. And she goes into the deepest depression. And what I pick up here is finally when she finds intimacy for the first time. By the way, Nelson Mandela never expected her and told her several times that he never expected her to remain celibate while he was in prison. She was 26 when he got there, and he was not coming back for a long, long time. And he knew that she had to carry on living a life. And here is something of the life that she tried to live. This is Brandfort in the late 1970s. A little less than a year into her banishments, the intensity for which she hungered finally came. It did so in the form of a young white doctor. From out of the blue, he wrote her a letter, hand-delivered to avoid prying eyes. He ran a general practice in the nearby town of Welkom, he told her, a practice dedicated entirely to the town's black settlement. He was in sympathy with her. Might he help her in any way? The letter was signed Chris Hatting. So I'm going to skip that bit, sorry. Hatting's sister, Suzanne, who was studying medicine in Bloemfontein at the time, later recalled her brother's excitement at his burgeoning friendship with Winnie. The 60-mile trip he made um, to Brandfort almost every day, despite his busy practice, the financial help he gave her. For several months, he heavily subsidized Winnie's and Zinzi's lives. The exhilaration he felt when sneaking her out of Brandfort in the early hours of the morning. His relationship with Winnie was dangerous, he told Suzanne. The security police were trailing him. He was feeling unsafe. At times, she thought that he was making it all up. There was a breathlessness in his tales that smacked of fantasy. She was never certain, but Suzanne Hatting suspected that her brother and Winnie were lovers. The security police who bugged Winnie's phone conversations with him and listened in when he visited were in no doubt. Dr. Hatting, a police officer, wrote in an internal memo, on the pretext that he was giving medical services to her, paid regular visits to Mrs. Mandela, who did not exactly hide the relationship. Indeed, the memo continues, they displayed their amorous feelings for each other on the streets of the White Town, scandalizing a shocked Brandfort public. In October 1978, several months after meeting her, Hatting offered Winnie a job. She would commute to Welkom each morning, run his surgery, and practice social work among his patients. It was the most exciting prospect. She would be out of the house from dawn till late, busy, working, absorbed in the lives of other human beings. She would also earn a salary. She began the soul-destroying task of applying to the Minister of Law and Order, who was responsible for her banning order. To take the job, it took months and a hefty pile of correspondence. Finally, on the afternoon of March the 5th, 1979, the last of the paperwork permitting the arrangement was signed. At about 8 that night, Hudson closed his practice and set off from Welkom to see Winnie. In the early hours of the following morning, Suzanne was woken by a phone call. Her brother, she was told, had died in a car accident. She should come immediately to the mortuary to identify the body. The whole business took an age, waiting to see the corpse, filling in the paperwork. It was dawn by the time she arrived at the scene of her brother's death. The police said that he had hit a cow in the darkness, but there was no bovine corpse at the roadside, nor trace of blood on the asphalt. Suzanne knew the professor of forensic pathology who conducted the autopsy. She had just recently sat in his classes. Over the coming months, she asked him repeatedly for the reports. There was always another reason why he could not share it just yet. In the decades to come, the suspicion never left her that the police had forced her brother off the road. Finding him still alive in his car, they had smashed in his head. After Chris Hatting's funeral, which was attended by hundreds of Tabong's black residents, Suzanne was called outside to find Winnie Mandela waiting for her. They had never met before. By way of greeting, Winnie embraced her and wept. Then she asked Suzanne for her phone number and hurried off. The two women met often. Winnie, Suzanne sensed, needed to see her, needed her proximity, needed the presence of a person who had been close to Chris Hatting. She spoke of him ceaselessly, of how much he meant to her, of how much he had done for her family. It struck Suzanne that Winnie was mourning him fiercely. Nearly 3 months after she was due to begin working for him, Winnie wrote to Mary Benson about the death of Chris Hatting. "They killed him and they have got away with it," she wrote. "Like the Steve Bikos, but this one is worse, as the world will never know. I haven't got over the shock yet, and I never knew I could give so much for somebody other than my own kind. In a way, it's taught me a deeper depth of love, which might have been more superficial or ideological. Now it's real and honest for those who identify with us so completely."
Well, good afternoon, everyone. And for those of you who are, online and present, you've got a brief synopsis into a very riveting book that we're going to discuss this afternoon. My name is Nantaka. I'll be your moderator. And some of the guests on this panel need no introduction. But of course, you heard from the author himself, Johnny Steinberg. Welcome, Johnny. Johnny is, of course, the author of the book, but he's also a very successful nonfiction author in South Africa. He's had multiple awards, really, both nationally from a South African perspective and internationally. And of course, apart from being an author, you also lecture part-time. Goodness me, I don't know where you find all that time, but welcome, Johnny.
Thank you.
Next to Johnny, we've got Elita Livelo. She is the counselor bilateral and the head of mission at the South African Embassy. And I might be speaking too much into the mic. But you're also a seasoned diplomat with South African diplomat with over 20 years experience. So welcome. And last but certainly not least, joined by Bart Luik. Bart is a journalist and writer who has been a correspondent based in Johannesburg since the 90s, and corresponding for the NOS and VPRO and Niva Review and VNU Dailies, amongst others. You've also edited award-winning TV series, Bart, and published several books, mostly about South Africa and Nelson Mandela, and also homosexuality in Africa. So welcome, Bart. And you also have been associated with the ZAM magazine, right? And for those who don't know the ZAM magazine, it's an online platform for African investigative journalism, photography, and opinion, basically. And you've also brought some wonderful artwork that is on display in the foyer outside. So please do take a look at those. One, of course, is a portrait of Winnie, and another of Nelson. So please, any donations and proceeds, of course, go towards this wonderful organization. So, everybody, and I think Johnny, maybe just a brief background, really, on maybe the why in writing this book. I mean, 2023 will be 10 years since Madiba passed away, and maybe almost 5 since Winnie Mandela passed away. So why release this now?
Thanks, Tano. Well, it began with really with Nelson Mandela's death, and the thought that once he had died, it became possible to write about him in new ways. I think it for the first time became possible to really write about him as a human being, and to do so in a way that was not an attack on him. I think to write about him in his roundedness, with everything, while he was alive, would have in a way been an attack on the South African project itself. And that was no longer true after he died. I think a new way of writing him emerged. So that was the initial idea, to write a biography of him. And one of the things I discovered very early in the research, and to my surprise, was as the years went on in jail, his very sense of self became increasingly tied to his wife, to Winnie Mandela. You read his letters over the years, and you find that his more than his attachment to her, his sense of who he was in the world became increasingly bound to her, and yet in quite a disturbing way, as the one passage that I read showed. The prisoner loses touch of who people on the outside are. So in one letter, she will be a young bride in her early 20s. A few paragraphs later, she'll be an aging woman in her 50s. And it struck me that if I was going to write about him, the marriage was the way through it. I also became increasingly interested in her. So as the project progressed, it became clear it was about the marriage and not about him.
Excellent. And I think interestingly, the book also kind of obviously touches on the early ages and how they grew up, kind of influenced who they became as adults ultimately. And I just maybe wanted to ask from you, even just from a research perspective. I mean, this is a huge project. I mean, to even go back to the early ages. I mean, how extensive was that research? How, who did you need to talk to? What did you need to look at? Were there people that refused to talk to you? Maybe just to give us a sense of just how large that research phase.
So there were many different sources. I won't go through all of them here, just a couple. So I think I interviewed about 150 people who knew them during the course of their lives, starting from Winnie's younger sisters, through to people who were close to them when they died. That was one source. I guess the most difficult and controversial source was in the last 10 years of his imprisonment. The Minister of Prisons, Kobie Coetzee, ordered that all of his conversations with visitors be bugged. And halfway through this project, I discovered that I could get access, that in fact there was open access to all the conversations he and Winnie had in the last 10 years of his imprisonment. So they were conducting their marriage through these recorded conversations. So that was another source. And obviously how one uses that is very sensitive and difficult. Many other sources, but just one to focus on here. he's just sitting down and reading the newspapers from the times when they met and became famous. The Black Johannesburg press of the 1950s and 60s, the Golden City Post, Drum, The World. And through those sources, you really see something very powerful about these two people, that they understood from the moment they met that what they looked like together was explosive. To be a beautiful, stylish black couple in the heart of apartheid South Africa, they understood that emitted a political message. And in a way, that's the start of the story. They were very ambitious people. They put their marriage out there as a political weapon from the very beginning, and it became the most extraordinary political weapon in the anti-apartheid struggle.
I think interestingly, the way they met, right? Like it's almost a bit like a meeting of fate. How you describe him driving past her in past Baragwanath. For those of anybody that's been past in Soweto, it's a very busy area and bustling at the time, I'd imagine. But to almost kind of intentionally want to pursue this young
Well,
lady.
the story that they tell about how they met is deceptive. I mean, the facts are true, but the substance is not quite.
Mm,
So the way they tell it, it's a standard story about a powerful older man and a beautiful younger woman. He was 38.
yeah.
He was married and had 3 children. He was a famous, glamorous lawyer. He drove this two-tone Oldsmobile, had bespoke suits. She was 20 years old, absolutely gorgeous, new to Johannesburg. He's driving past Baragwanath Hospital. He sees this beautiful woman, half his age, at a bus stop, and he thinks of turning the car around. And instead, he finds her phone number. Um, and what happens is a familiar old gendered story of an older man and a younger woman. But I think that beneath that very cliched story, something very different was happening, something they didn't speak about openly. She was much, much more powerful than that old cliched story suggests. She was just really beginning to discover. She was a woman in the 1950s, and for a whole range of reasons, given her upbringing that we can't go into great detail right now, she didn't believe that any place in the world that a man could go, she couldn't go, including the public sphere, including the political sphere. But as a woman in the 1950s, there was very little space to do that. And I think she learned quite quickly to use the power of her presence, of her beauty, of her charisma, to move in the world.
Mm.
And by the time she met Nelson Mandela, many older men had courted her, and she'd she'd used she'd used this to her presence in the world very, very skillfully, very powerfully.
And I think you also maybe make mention a little bit that she was actually also engaged at the time, right? At the time of court.
Well, what she did is she essentially played two men off each other. She was seeing another man for 2 years before she met Nelson Mandela, and she told both Mandela and this other man, whose name was Barney Sampson, that she was engaged to them, and carried on seeing them both right up until a month before her wedding to Nelson Mandela. Um, and so she would play others. She wouldn't be played. She she really. I mean, one has to choose one's words carefully. The little power as a woman in the 1950s that she could gather to herself, she did. And she was massively resourceful and tenacious and kept pushing things to the bound of acceptability. And that absolutely dazzled Nelson Mandela when he was writing to her from prison 10 years later. He kept on wanting to remind her how scandalous she was, how unacceptable she was, because he wanted to relive the electricity of that moment. She was going on living her life. He wanted to remind her how special, how outrageous things were between her. He was worried he was going to lose her. So in these letters, he pours these memories of quite how electric things were between them when they first met.
Yeah. And Ms. Libela, maybe from your side, I mean, you grew up in apartheid South Africa a little bit. Maybe just to bring in your sort of insight of the movement back then and the perception of the couple.
Sure, it's hard to reflect on that, but I'm going to be a little bit brief. There are two ways that we need to look into the Mandela story, which it goes mostly into culture, goes mostly into the issue of the migrant workers, And also the way that the story has been narrated to us is the first wife is non-existent until the divorce. So we don't know at that time where was the first wife. Was Mandela the migrant worker, or where was Evelyn at that time and the three kids? So looking at the apartheid and the reflection back to it is we know, and it has been narrated many times to say, except Winnie, Mandela had other extramarital affairs where it was proven and known amongst most of the comrades or people within the political movement, together with his colleagues or learned friends in the law firm. They knew that the man had more extramarital affairs, but it tended to be ignored, and it tended to be a surprise to him when Winnie is playing the same game. Because um, to me, it's like it was a fair game. I'm going in, I'm dating a married man, and I still have a boyfriend, and I'll keep my boyfriend. And both of them, they need to know that. And that is how the apartheid system tend to destroy a lot of families, where you will get that families, they don't stay together. Even if you look at the areas act, where in Soweto the houses was mostly for the migrant workers working in the greater Johannesburg. Most of the families, especially from the independent states, were not allowed to access except the workers. So you can see that the way Mandela lived at that time, the independence he had, and the interaction that he had with most of the ladies. He was a free man. Evelyn was not home. And that is the story that nobody tells us. And we need to dig deeper on that.
She was home.
Oh, okay, okay. You and then you say that she was home, but also from the perspective part of it is nobody is telling us about what Evelyn was going through at that time. But we are also being told to the end that is the woman that ended up giving up on her life, mother of three, and try to raise children independently away from the father. So, which means that this kind of system of apartheid as well, you have these single professionals that stays in the camp, that is Winnie and the friends, and you have the Mandelas of that time. But also culture has taught us that a man cannot have one wife. So it was better being done and looking at the background where both come from, both are the closest, and culture may also allows them to have more than one wife. But also you have Evelyn that felt like she needs something better for her own family. She was not willing to share the husband, and she ended up leaving her own home. But also, as you said, to say that also the character that we see in Evelyn is she became one of the women that she doesn't want to play a role in this active life of the husband, as well as the famous part where Mandela was wanted to be. Maybe she also discovered that the husband was doing other politics underground, and she withdrew herself from the whole platform. That actually become it is a sad story, because then the children get not to have the present father at that time. So that is the story that we find in the whole system and the beginning of the Mandela and Winnie story.
And maybe from your experience, of course, you maybe come from the realms of Limpopo and not so much Johannesburg, but in that area, I would also assume that that's fairly what is happening too, at the time, that fathers are leaving, having to migrate to, a richer economical area, and having to leave their, wives and children um, to take care of the family. Because that's also something that was sort of prevalent then as well.
That's true. On my maternal grand on my maternal side, the grandparents, we had the similar story where my grandfather was from the greater Limpopo and mostly the independent states of the apartheid at that time, moving to be a police officer and a pastor later in a smaller community. My grandfather, who was 18 years older than my grandmom, get to marry this 16-year-old that the culture has allowed him to marry and pay lobola to it. And you look how their marriage evolves as well. There's nothing different from what we see from Winnie and Nelson, and also from Evelyn, because my grandfather as well had other extra kids except the one that he got to have in a marriage, which shows that how most of the families tend to be affected by the issue of migration and also looking for opportunities. And also, is you have as well at that time, you have most people that becomes professional in the society as well, and people wants to marry the equivalent of the same, that also affect the people, other women that were not educated. Men were more privileged to have access to better employment as compared to the women, and automatically it affected a lot of women that they had the first engagement with male partners. That is why in South Africa you will get that a male person may have 3 or 4 kids before he get married, because you see that on how he moved professionally. A black police officer in South Africa was not allowed to serve in the same police station for more than 2 years, because then when you serve in the same police station for more than 2 years, you end up knowing the community, so they will move them around. And that is why most of the police officers of that time, they tend to be like the mine workers. They end up having kids all over the places where they have served, until the early 60s or early 70s, where police officers were left at a certain time. But did it solve the problem? No, because already the system has taught these men to go and rove around and be as independent as much as they can, away from their families and forming other side line families or smaller families wherever they are. Yes, we have those kind of results in anywhere in South Africa, and it's still visible even today. It's still even affecting some other families. The story of Winnie and Nelson that became the most political story to be narrated to us is one of many, but it tends to be one of the known because they end up having a certain platform in the South African society or political society. But we have that in our communities. We still have the distorted families due to the migrant workers. We don't have stabilities in our families and so forth. That is the case. I mean, you ask yourself, a person of Mandela's stature, irrespective of his education background, why we are not told about the 3 kids from Evelyn interacting with him? How often did he interact with him? Even if he was in prison, he became an absent father. And that is why I think towards the end, or him being released from prison, he tried to bring the whole family together, but it was the most complicated thing to bring all your kids together, that they have lived so many decades in your absence. They have tried to strive, they have tried to be better, but I think everything came and happened at a late stage. It was too late for him, the energy wasn't there, he was already old. And I think even if he wanted to pass some other regulations and whatever, they will say that we survived without you. And what more can you say? I think that's why I see the whole story, to say for him, he could not have told us, but he felt it so bad to be an absent father. That is why he became very close to his grandchild, Mandla Mandela, is because he was never present to Mandla's father. The only person that he felt like I need to pay back to, it was Mandla. That's how it is. And that is the role of an absent father in families, and that's how we are.
I see John, you may be wanting to respond there a little bit, but I was just going to ask you, I mean, devil's advocate here, he was an absent father, not to his own doing. So perhaps he did try and write those letters to those families or to his kids, or he did try to reach out. I mean, don't necessarily know whether or not they ultimately reached them, or if they are, if they could also respond back. So in that case, it's maybe a little bit more telling of the times, of perhaps an absent father wanting to be present but unable to be present because of forces outside of his control controlling any kind of letters or correspondence that he's trying to reach. So maybe from that perspective, is there maybe a chance, or could you think that it is possible that may have been able to parent from prison, perhaps?
The reason why I portray him as an absent father is because the same system still appears in South Africa, where you have people being imprisoned for things that they haven't done. Um, Not denying the fact that South Africa it's got the highest criminal rates, but as well as post apartheid, there were no better rehabilitation being made in actually detoxing or decolonizing the whole system of how to rehabilitate a person, and especially a father figure to a family. I mean, I come from a legal background and I know what's happening in the criminal courts where people have been pushed for certain circumstances to be away, but also from criminal activities. But also, we are growing to be a society that is continuously creating the absenteeism of parenthood in certain families, and one of them being the key leader, being the father. Uh, yes, you can say circumstances prohibited him to interact with the first family, which is a fact, but also on our side, as the readers, and especially as the young people, we haven't seen that rehabilitation part of the first family to the father himself. The father being released from prison, he became the father of the nation than the father of his own family. Does that meaning that the whole family suffered because of the father that was away and he came back, he became the father of the nation? Yes, it has the huge impact to the family. And then what do we do about it? And that is one example that I think our government or our current administration needs to learn. What do we do in the nation building and making the fathers to be the present fathers of today? We don't have it in South Africa. That is why we have this vacuum of the absenteeism of fatherhood in our communities, whether black and whether white. There's so much of migration happening, especially in the black communities, still chasing opportunities, still chasing employment into the bigger cities. And the children grows with the mothers. Whether the parents are marriage is just an administration of a communal between the two people. But what does it take to build a family? And this is what it happened to the Mandela family. What does it take to build a family? You have two people portrayed, and you narrated the story very well. But if you look at the outcome of it, even for the Winnie Mandela's daughters, you will realize that there was absenteeism. Definitely, there was absenteeism. And that is the system that created the absenteeism. Okay. But also, you can ask yourself, if Mandela was not being arrested, will he play it better with the first family? That is another story and another question to be asked. To say that you are not arrested, you are a good lawyer in the community, and you have the first three kids, but Evelyn has given up on you. Therefore, what's going to happen? Because that is the story that became muted in the whole storytelling of the Mandela family.
I think interestingly, you touched on the fact that, of course, once he was released from prison, that he became a father to the nation and, maybe not so say a father to his own family, but because so much time had passed since he last was able to say parent in person, let's say. Do you think that, and maybe Johnny, a question to you here, do you think that there was a notion that he had that would merely just pick up from where he left off? You know, the family had continued, but surely it still needed a father.
So, um, uh, I think we need to go back to his first marriage for that. So they weren't a migrant family. They met in Johannesburg, and they were both full-time residents of Johannesburg. They in fact married at a court. Not even with family involved. It was in that sense a very modern marriage. Um, and Evelyn expected Nelson to be monogamous. She did not want him to sleep with other women, and that was one of the sources of their deep conflict, and the marriage ended terribly. It ended really bad. Evelyn in her court documents describes domestic violence in the relationship, and Mandela responds and admits to some of it. It was a very nasty marriage, and it happened in a small house with the children watching, and two of those children turned against their father as a result of the divorce. And I mention that not because it's salacious personal detail, but because as Mandela grew old in prison, he felt this extraordinary remorse about having not been a good family man. And say, can he be a father from prison? He tried desperately hard to be a father from prison, and in a way too hard. He almost tried to pick his children up by the scruff of the neck from prison and put them back right again because things weren't going right with their lives. He used his power and his fame to get Zinzi, his youngest child, into UCT when she wasn't qualified. He muscled his way in. He got a prison warden to basically spy on her, to go and see her at UCT twice a day to see that she was okay. He was so remorseful about his children going wrong. He so much thought it was his fault. He put so much the burden on his shoulders that he literally did try to rearrange his entire family and put it on another course from prison. But how can you do that from prison? And I think by the time a few days after he left prison, he described his life as a tragedy. And he meant a number of things by that. I mean, he meant that he had 27 years taken away. But he also meant that he felt that his family was ruined, and that it was because of his life that they were ruined. Partly because of the apartheid states and that he was taken away from them, but partly because of the life he lived before. And a remarkable thing about him, when he was released, he was probably the most famous human being in the world. And at one level, he enjoyed that fame because it was politically useful. It meant that he could play a powerful role in averting civil war and bringing majority rule and democracy. But he never confused that fame for personal happiness. And he genuinely believed his own life to be a sad and tragic one, and his children's lives to be sad lives, and discovered that for all his power, all his public power, and all for that he was the father of a new nation, he couldn't ever be the father that he wanted to be. That time had gone on and it was too late. So the stuff you're talking on, the family questions, are they're very difficult questions. I think for Nelson Mandela, they were the most difficult questions, and the sources of his deepest regret, and I think his deepest sadness.
And maybe turning to the international stage, Bart, maybe just to give us your perception, perhaps, of the Mandela Union and the movement that occurred in the Netherlands as it was influenced. Either, happy to share.
Yeah, maybe a few remarks. First, to say that I'm deeply impressed by Johnny's book. It's in many ways, I think, a masterpiece. And if there would be some award for demystification, then it should go to you, I think, this year and the next years. So going back to the days of the anti-apartheid movement, a few thoughts. Maybe one thing is that I think the reason why Winnie had such an appeal to many of us in the anti-apartheid movement had lots to do with the fact that she was a woman on her own right. She was not Nelson's wife. She was, but she was, of course, as an anti-apartheid movement, we were in close touch with the ANC Women's League, which was in those days quite a conservative or traditionalist body. And under the leadership of, I think it was Gertrude Chopin, and then coming with statements all the time, we must stand with our man. And Winnie, of course, wanted to play her own role, wanted to be a person in that struggle against apartheid. And she was. So In the 80s, when there was in the Netherlands and in other countries in Europe, there's this what I think it's called the second wave of the feminist movement. It very much fit into to that, and that partly explains the enthusiasm that people felt for Winnie. The other thing was that, and I'm focusing a bit on Winnie, I think here, is that we also deeply felt that in a way she, but maybe also, I'm sure also Nelson, were the embodiment of a people hurt and damaged and traumatized and deconstructed, and thrown apart. Um, and so also the things that happened in the second half of the 80s when all these incidents and stuff happened in Winnie's circle, and human rights violations, um, should be in a way understood within this context. It's not by way of defending all the things that were wrong, but understanding what was going on and what it did to her. So, um, and I think that also maybe partly explains why Winnie, up to her last days, had such an immense constituency in South Africa, because there was this empathy and understanding what people went through, and people understood, I think, very well that what she had gone through and all the humiliation and imprisonment and torture and whatever, uh, um, it does something to a person. So, last remark here, when it comes to, I think there was a slight discrepancy between how we felt within the anti-apartheid movement about these issues and quite a few of the media, where you always came across these frames. I clearly remember from the second half of the 80s, huge billboards in our country with portraits of Winnie Mandela and the slogan, "The Mother of the Nation." That was by Panorama, which was quite a right wing weekly. It was just the thing this is what the audience or what the public or what the readership wants, so we go for that. And then, of course, when we got to know about a number of those things that had happened with the soccer team and everything and Stompy, and so that it suddenly turned into a completely different story. There she was, now she was the witch. And there was never something in between. There was no this complexity in between those different frames that I think we also failed in ways an anti-apartheid movement to bring that complex uh, uh, complicated story to the public.
And interesting that you've sort of mentioned the feminist move, the second wave of the feminist movement coming in the 80s, because I think the 80s was potentially a very tumultuous time in Winnie's life. And I think there were multiple scandals that came about. And I think, in some way, from your take, I suppose, Johnny, Nelson tries to reel her in on that because he was, his character had changed by that point, where he'd been, as you said, remorseful, maybe a little bit more, thoughtful to the movement. But she kind of kept that revolutionary sort of stance moving forward. So, interestingly, as you say, she became a hero, the mother of the nation, and then turned into the witch almost. But does that notion sort of continue, say, into the 90s and well into her death? Because I think, interestingly, in South Africa, or at least from the young population side, that kind of turns into sort of the mother of the nation notion again.
I think you touch upon one of the things that what I think is one of the great things of Johnny's book. in there's no hesitance in confronting all these with all the things that have happened, and they're being presented to us in a pretty factual way, and based on a lot of interviews and evidence and other sources and whatever. Um, but um, the um, the the idea of that you had at one hand Nelson, who was the reconciliatory person who wanted to talk and get over the armed struggle and beyond it and whatever, and then you have Winnie at the other end and as a revolutionary until the end of her days and wanting to uh, um, take over the country and whatever. I mean, I remember from my first visit to South Africa in December 1990, arriving from Johannesburg in Cape Town at somebody's place, and then within half an hour, we're sitting in the garden around the table with a glass of wine, and there was this huge debate going on about all the strategic and tactics that were involved in the struggle, and we must do this and that. And one of the things that I liked so much in the ANC in those days was this fight about all these ideas and perspectives and trying to find a way out of things. So um, and that so it's not bad to have those different opinions. And what I felt when I read Johnny's book was that they were actually brought together again, while different perspectives, the revolutionary and a more reconciliatory man, though. I mean, some of the anecdotes show a revengeful side of Nelson that we didn't know about before. Some of the anecdotes about Winnie shows a reconciliatory person that we didn't know before. So that's the demystification in your book. But they somehow come together again. So you actually brought them together again in your book, and even literally, of course, in the end, that is what happened on her deathbed, where there was Winnie sitting with him. So that makes it so it's not fight. I mean, there's fights about all these strategies or whatever, and what is, I think, regrettable in this zigzagging of perceptions towards Winnie and Nelson is that it's either this or that, while they're both part of one story.
Johnny, I think you also touch on the fact that, perhaps towards the end of Winnie's life as well, she kind of remains telling the story of her marriage and how they being the apartheid government, um, how they continuously sort of, inflicted hurt and pain in multiple ways onto her husband. Do you think that her in telling that story, and telling that emotion, I suppose, kind of, yeah, aligns with, say, the born frees, who sort of weren't part of the struggle, someone like myself, who was kind of born on the cusp of being free, and kind of views her still as the mother of the nation, a stoic woman, and that was also at the bedside of her husband until death, you know.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, to start in the 1980s, then, as opposed to what they look like to Born Frees now. Um, so both Nelson and, just to go on from what Bart was saying, both Nelson and Winnie Mandela very much believed in armed struggle in the 1980s, but they had very different conceptions of how that struggle should be waged and what its aims were. Nelson Mandela, from a very early period, from 1962, when he visited the Algerian liberation fighters in Morocco, believed fervently that the apartheid state could never be overthrown by military force, that there would have to be a negotiated settlement, as there was in Nigeria and in Algeria in the early 1960s, and believed that throughout his time in prison. But he nonetheless believed armed struggle to be essential, really because he believed that his great fear about his country is how violent it was. and he believed that violence was inevitable and that people would want to take up arms against this brutal state. And he was very, very fearful of that. He watched the Defiance campaign fall apart in 1952 through violence. He didn't believe that the participation of masses in violence could be controlled. And for him, what the armed struggle was, in a way, a displacement, that instead of being violent themselves, ordinary people could watch a military force representing them being violent in a controlled and disciplined manner. And people could experience violence vicariously rather than be violent themselves. And for him, that was a crucial aspect of armed struggle. It was to give people inspiration, to give people a sense of power, a sense of agency and purpose, but without mass violence. He was quite afraid of the participation of masses in history. And for him, that's what armed struggle was partly for. For Winnie, she, by the 1980s, had a radically different conception of armed struggle. She literally wanted to arm tens and thousands of young people, and believed that unless apartheid ended through a mass insurrection, it wouldn't end at all. But she went about it without any sense of organizational discipline at all. She tried to literally build it from her house in Soweto, and it did go horribly, horribly wrong. But the way she told that story towards the end of her life, she was an extraordinarily skillful storyteller, especially about her marriage. And the way she told the story is that all the years Nelson Mandela spent in prison, he was sheltered essentially from the experience of being a Black South African. And by the time he released, he had lost contact with Black experience. And so the apartheid state was negotiating with a shadow, not with a real substantial embodiment of Black experience. Quite a harsh thing to say, that he was treated too well. I think he suffered enormously. Whereas she said, Winnie Mandela, was in the face of it. She said, I am the embodiment of Black experience. I am the embodiment of the suffering, of the torture. I was the one who she used such physical metaphors, who faced the enemy in the flesh. I'm the one who was there. And if I'd been controlled in the early 1990s, we would have fought on. We wouldn't have given up. And I think that speaks to Born Free's profoundly for a number of reasons. And one is that people are very disillusioned with the democratic order, and so become skeptical of how this order came about. And here's somebody who was saying, if I was in control, it would have been very different. Apartheid would have ended differently. The new order would have been different. That speaks powerfully to Born Frees. And the other way in which I think it speaks powerfully to this generation is it's about emotion and feeling and experience. It's saying my politics are born from my suffering and my pain, that there's quite a simple relationship between them. And that sort of expressiveness, I think, speaks very powerfully to young people today.
Maybe also just to backtrack to the 90s here a little bit. Of course, we know Nelson Mandela gets released in February of 1990. And in June of 1990, he comes to the Netherlands, Bart, and he is accompanied by his wife, Winnie. And, some media also sort of portray it that, initially he, didn't accept the invite to come to the Netherlands, but then ultimately had a change of mind and paid a visit. Could you explain just that atmosphere at the time on June 16, 1990?
I can from hearsay because I was in Paris at the time with my friend and colleague Evelyn Groening, who was investigating Dulce September's murder, and we were interviewing people there.
Journalists' work never ends.
Absolutely. And I think one day after he arrived, I got a phone call from my colleagues at the anti-apartheid movement that Mandela would come to Amsterdam, but we had planned things already in such a way that we couldn't go back earlier on. So, but of course, when I got back, I heard all the stories. 20,000 people at Leidseplein. Interestingly, there was a huge presence of people with a Surinamese and Antillean background, and that we noticed in the last years of the 80s, when there were more and more anti-apartheid marches and picket lines and rallies and whatever. that those communities were trying to connect much more than before. That it's a complicated story that nothing to do with South Africa, but all the difficult developments or problematic developments in Suriname. So there was this huge excitement, and again coming from all kinds of communities in Amsterdam. The Amsterdam mayor, Ed van Tijn, he was actually one of the founders of the first anti-apartheid grouping in the Netherlands in the early 60s. Um, after we got to know that Mandela would be released, that was not on the 2nd of February. Then it was said that he will be released. It was not yet a date set. And then it was announced on, I think, a day before or so. And then he called for this spontaneous demonstration already in Amsterdam on the 2nd of, or the on the night of the 10th of February. And then he forgot to inform the police. So there were thousands of people, and it all went very well. And so we had from those the 11th of course, on the 2nd of February, when we were, maybe that's one more anecdote, we were watching de Klerk's speech in the offices of the anti-apartheid movement, and the spokesperson of the movement was sick. And when de Klerk had started, was 5 minutes or so, there was a phone call from, I think it was Reuters, one of the press agencies. So somebody said, can you take that phone, because the spokesperson was sick. And then the guy said to me, I've got a speech from de Klerk here, and he will announce Mandela's release. He will legalize will start the unbanning of the ANC and other political movements, and etc., etc. What is your comment? And then I said, well, we've heard this before. So let's first wait for the end of the speech. And I walked back to the room where we were all watching that speech, and I was sitting next to Connie Braam, the chairperson of the anti-apartheid movement, and I whispered in her ear, going to announce the etc., etc. And then Connie said, no. And then he announced it. So right at that moment, and then I think our offices exploded. And for the rest of the day, hundreds of people came into the office, and it was a huge party, and it never stopped until June. When Mandela came to Amsterdam, and on this balcony, and we, from 2019, that's my last remark here, we took up a suggestion by the Nelson Mandela Foundation to revive the Nelson Mandela lecture in the Netherlands, so as ZAM, and so we did that, and we've just had the 4th edition in February. With Panashe Shigomatsi, South African Zimbabwean speaker, and Marcus Desando, the chairperson of the director of the Prince Claus Fund, and Jerry Afrier, delivering that lecture. And so that was the 4th edition. So it's sacred ground there, and it will be that forever.
And everybody remembers that iconic picture, of course. So, and I do hope the audience has some questions. I hope I'm also not taking up all your time with my questions. So, if anybody from the audience or on the live stream, of course, has some questions, please feel free to ask them. Maybe I'll pause now in case anybody does already have any questions to ask. If not, yeah.
I suppose, Johnny, some of your other books in the past have always been about like focusing on individual experience and then making a political comment through that individual experience. So the farm murders, or the AIDS epidemic, or Man of Good Hope. What's your message here?
Well, in a way, these two particular people make it easy to do that, because they put their marriage out there as the embodiment of a national struggle for freedom. So they wanted us to think of them living these double lives as two individuals, but as the embodiments of a nation. And the moment Nelson Mandela went to jail, that story became so astoundingly powerful. For its simplicity, they were already very famous and glamorous. Then they understood the power of celebrity. And from the moment he went to jail, their story was, here is this beautiful couple torn asunder. One of them locked up indefinitely, the other a single mother of 2 children. And the moment they're reunited is the moment their people are free. And the two stories really did become one. And largely thanks to Oliver Tambo in London, the ANC projected the story into the world, and it became the story of the anti-apartheid struggle, as a conscious strategy, an extraordinary strategy, which I document in the book. And by the 1980s, it was more successful than anybody could have imagined. They were the most famous couple in the world, and their story was as simple as they wanted it to be. But I guess what makes it all nice and interesting for a writer like me is that my presumption is that their tale does embody a national tale, but in ways over which they lost control. For instance, Nelson Mandela wanting a peaceful settlement, Winnie Mandela literally behind his back while going to see him in prison, trying to organize an armed insurrection. This deep, deep conflict about how apartheid should end embodied in the marriage. And much more than that, I think, Nelson Mandela's great, great fear was that his country would descend into civil war, and he wanted to stop it for all he was worth. But being in prison, he was cut off from the world and out of touch, and I don't think understood that the violence he so feared was in his home and in his family. And so this doubleness of a marriage and a nation really winds itself together in their story and makes it an intriguing book to write. And as a sense, is a gift for a writer that you can write about a marriage and a national story together.
Thank you for that.
I have to introduce myself, otherwise probably you don't understand my question. I've been since 1983 correspondent in Nairobi for a major Dutch newspaper, and I just happen to be here. So maybe I do have a bit of an African perspective of the South African miracle, or whatever you want to call it. Two questions which probably have one answer. Africa since 1994, about the same time that you celebrated your independence, has been searching or reintroduced multi-party democracy, a liberal democracy, rights for minorities, and every 4 or 5 years elections, and in principle a 2-term limit for presidents. That is what the example of South Africa gave us. I wonder how much is that to the credit of the two Mandelas, that they did choose that model of democracy and society. And the second question is, and I think it is the same answer, how much was he still in touch with what was happening in Africa at that particular time? He visited some people. We wonder whether they were the right people. Gaddafi was one. But the example of South Africa, which we thought was the example for the rest of Africa, I don't think that's the case anymore. But how much is it to the credit of the two Mandelas that form of governance was chosen?
That's a really interesting question. I think that process of liberalization and democratization was happening anyhow, and with or without the Mandelas, and with or without South Africa, it became the only model of acceptability in both in the Eastern Bloc and in Africa and in Latin America in 3 different waves. They all had to become multi-party democracies, and that it was a global historical process, following the end of the Cold War, and it would have happened with or without the Mandelas. I think the question was, how substantial can you make a multi-party democracy? I think that one of the unfortunate consequences is that you could just sort of tick that block, multi-party democracy, and rather than look more substantially at what was happening in society and what sort of democratic mechanisms it had. And by the early 2000s, it became clear that you could tick the parliamentary democracy box and still not be an especially free society. And in that sense, I think South Africa was an exception. It genuinely did become a free society under Nelson Mandela, and in such difficult circumstances with deep racial divisions and deep economic inequality, it did become a genuine democracy. And whether it could have without Mandela is a counterfactual that we don't know. It may have descended into civil war in the early 90s. Who knows? It's just one of those impossible counterfactuals.
Saying we go for a one-party system.
Uh,
For example, that was not a debate. I don't know who I have to address the question to.
I if we look back at the history, we go back to the CODESA. That's where you can see where the multi-party system came in, because South Africa at that time in the 90s had CODESA 1 that failed because they were trying to be all-inclusive from the ban and the unbanning of all the political parties, and the CODESA 2 as well. So, and as he said, to say that if you look at the system that was used at that time, it became actually a model to different countries as well, where parties were brought together. And I think in Africa, South Africa was the first to actually include themselves without any external parties and negotiate, which was tough because CODESA 1 failed and CODESA 2 became a success. And based on that model, most of the countries, even in South America, became prominent with that in leading towards the negotiations and putting the parties together. So I think the model, as he explained, overviewing the whole life of Winnie, who for her it was more of saying, let's take an arm and spear and fight. And depending how many people dies on the battle, that's how we can conquer. And you have Mandela and his former comrades or the late comrades that built up the whole multi-party negotiations. And that is a model that we can say that it has worked better for both of the Mandelas. Whether winning, that has brought international attention to the world, because as he reflected on the life of Winnie in the struggle and putting up the whole battle to make South Africa known of all the treatments, and the parties that came together later and negotiate for the further of democracy, we can say that both of them, they did play a role in bringing the whole society together in South Africa. And the negotiations part of it, because it doesn't matter who won, but all the parties were on the platform to talk about the future of the country.
Just one tiny addition: the ANC's Harare Declaration of 1988 called for multi-parliamentary democracy. A document Mandela wasn't directly involved in. It was it was a decommitment that came from much broader than him.
Any other questions from the floor?
Well, Yoni, in the first place, congratulations with this book, and welcome again in this house. It's always difficult to compare, but it always comes to my mind if you compare it with Martin Luther King. The opponent of Martin Luther King was, of course, J. Edgar Hoover, who really wanted to destroy the marriage, and who sent tapes to Coretta when he was in somewhere in a hotel with, for example, a whore. And the opponent of Mandela and Winnie was, of course, Swanepoel, who really wanted to destroy. Maybe you can reflect on that. Swanepoel and J. Edgar Hoover, they didn't succeed. They wanted to destroy this marriage because of all the...
That's really interesting because, going back to Nelson and Evelyn, they had a terrible, terrible divorce. It was truly horrible for them, their children, their extended families, everybody. And in the course of it, Evelyn lodged these court papers accusing Nelson of domestic violence. He wrote a reply in which he acknowledged that there was some violence in their, potentially scandalous documents. He never submitted it to court. And when his office was raided, when he was arrested for treason in December 1956, that document was found in his office and taken. And the prosecution in the treason trial shared it with his lawyers, and they had this gentleman's agreement among them not to use it. Uh, and it sat in an archive until a historian found it in 2012, half a century later. So in a sense, your story is the opposite. There was almost a gentleman's agreement among enemies that private life is private. It's one of the more strangest and more extraordinary stories of the struggle against apartheid. That it was decided that it was nobody's business. It's an interesting story.
Maybe just one more questions from the floor, and we'll give it to our gentleman in the corner there, of course.
It's just a short follow-up on what you just told us, because you write in your book that at that time you said a gentleman's agreement, but you also said that torture was actually not part of the apartheid system until the early the 60s. So if they had found that document later on, maybe they would have used it against Nelson Mandela. What do you think?
Yes, well, torture as an organized, focused activity was introduced in 1963, and yes, all the rules changed. And Winnie was tortured under that new system, not physically but psychologically. They used Winnie's sex life against Nelson. They would bring him news about what they said his wife was up to, and they did that relentlessly, almost as a form of torture. Literally hundreds of times they'd say Winnie's sleeping with this one, Winnie's sleeping with that one, but they never really used it publicly ever, except a little bit towards the end. So the Hoover story doesn't quite fit into the South African context. But yes, they tried to hit him as hard as they possibly could with that. In fact, they'd have his warders wear bugs and instruct the warders to say, "We've just discovered that your wife is sleeping with X. What do you say?" And record his response. So they developed an obsession with it, but it happened privately. It happened in their relationship with him rather than in any public campaign.
Well, thank you, everyone, for those insightful questions. Maybe just a closing remark from everybody. I had maybe just one question, and we can maybe just close with that. Just from each and every one of you on the panel at the moment. I mean, would you view Winnie as the woman behind Nelson, the woman next to him, or the woman ahead of him? Just to reflect on that, what you would think. Well, ladies first.
I will say I will view Winnie as a woman next to Nelson. She has never lived her life without Mandela, even if he was in prison. She knew why they were together. She stand by it. And irrespective of all the circumstances, she emerged to make sure that the husband is freed. And freed indeed such that he reminded him still after his release what the people are saying. He said, the people of South Africa are still waiting for the promises I've made to them when we fought for this freedom. So she has never distanced herself not to be the wife. She played both roles very well, being the mother and still being the wife, continuously visit the husband without any fail. And yeah, she was always by his side. She has never been behind or against him.
Bart, maybe from you in an international sense?
I fully agree with Olita, and Nelson is next to Winnie, and Winnie is next to Nelson. But if we play a little bit with gender, I would say Walter Sisulu is the woman behind Nelson Mandela, because that is the one who kind of put him forward, if that's the right impression, and also a ideological and strategical mastermind, and a man that's been internationally for sure almost forgotten. one of his fellow comrades in prison, but he's been extremely important. So yeah, but Winnie was definitely next to Nelson.
And maybe from yourself, Johnny, after
Well,
the cons-
I'm reluctant to add anything. I mean, those are both very, very wise and perceptive observations. And I add one thing is that what I discovered writing this book, and honestly didn't know before, that it was primarily through Winnie that Nelson understood that he was alive. You know, both in the late 50s when they were courting, you know, his excitement is almost beyond words. And then when he was in prison, and really felt his soul shrivel because he'd been divorced from his life. It was the woman that he kept reconstituting himself through again and again. So it really is, in the saddest and most profound way, a love story.
Well, I think both characters in this book are highly complex. You cannot just look at them in one lens and sort of say, well, this is Nelson in this decade or Winnie in that decade. I mean, they evolve as people through their marriage and through the struggle. And Johnny, I want to just commend you for sort of capturing that and conducting such extensive research into that. And I would hope that every single person in here, online, goes out, gets your book, and just ponders on what your discovery has found. So thank you for, providing some insight, Alita, as well, Bart. Really appreciate your insight from the international context perspective. And to each and every one of you here that, brazed the Amsterdam sun, basically, or even the Dutch sun that is the hottest day in the year, I want to say. So thank you all for your attendance as well. So thank you very much. And we've got some networking to get to.